before lunch. We talked yesterday about how the ANA did a survey that reveals 72% of folks do integrated marketing, but a minority of them believe they're getting really good results, which means the majority feel that they need to do things differently. And Monitor is going to tell us a little bit about the things we should do differently. Monitor is the international consulting firm that specializes in driving growth. Speaking for Monitor today is Steve Goldbach. He is partner and co-head of the New York office. His specialty is focusing on packaged goods, media, retail, and sports sectors, with an emphasis on how companies can best reach, there's that word again, reach, and engage with consumers. Steve co-led Monitor's work with Procter & Gamble to reinvent their approach to consumer communications. Previous to Monitor, Steve was with Forbes magazine group as their director of strategy, and he holds an MBA from Columbia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Goldbach.
Thanks, Marcia. Thanks very much, Marcia, for that lovely introduction and reminding everyone that I do have a Columbia MBA, which according to Craig Stacey means that I don't like to do math. So you don't have to worry, there's not going to be too much math in this presentation. If we were about refreshing memory structures, which we like to talk about, which we just heard from Byron about, I would be standing up here in my Vibram five-finger shoes. So for those of you who were at last year's pre-conference, you might remember I got up and gave a presentation and extolled the virtues of Vibram's five-finger shoes. Well, unfortunately, I'm not wearing something that you can laugh at least visibly. I'm not wearing anything that you can laugh at today. But that being said, we've got a lot to talk about this morning, and I actually want to start with some advice. Some advice from someone who lived before the world of likes, before the world of tweets, before the world of blogs, and before the word checking in meant what it does today. I want to get some advice from Albert. And amazingly, I'm not getting advice from Albert on anything that has to do with regressions, correlation, vector autoregression, or anything complicated of that, although the world of marketing has gotten sufficiently complicated that it is important to get advice from rocket scientists every now and then. What I want to get advice from Albert on is in the world of psychology, or maybe even psychiatry. And he talks about insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, what the heck does that have to do with the world of marketing? Aren't we making lots of change? Hasn't everyone come up here at this conference so far with something that represents the tumultuous change that we've been facing over the last couple of years? Well, if you read the popular press, you can't avoid all the change that has seemingly gone on for the last 10 years or so. You can't avoid it. We've been changing our agencies. We've been changing our approach to digital. We've been experimenting with new media. We've been doing this. We've been doing that. Lots and lots of change going on in the world. And you agree. You agree. So 90% of you in the survey that we conducted over the course of the weekend said that you have some sort of integrated marketing program on your business. On some brands, on all brands, but there's something going on that feels different in your business today. 90% of you. So let's play a little game here. We asked the question, how many of you have some sort of integrated marketing program on your business? And 90% of you said on either some or all brands. We asked a different question, which was, how many of you are satisfied with the results of your integrated marketing programs? And we gave you a scale of 1 to 5. So by show of hands, how many people think that over 50% of the audience said 5? I'm satisfied on a scale of 5. Of 5. Nobody. Anyone want to raise their hands and say 25%? 25%? 25%? Any other takers? How about at 10%? Would anyone say 10% were willing to say they were very satisfied with their brands? Well, I'm going to give you the answer, and I'm actually going to look for someone. As of Sunday, there was actually nobody that had responded. In this audience, nobody responded that they were satisfied. As of Monday, one person, one mystery person So if that person is in the room and not using the bathroom right now and not refreshing their coffee, could they please volunteer themselves? Who's the person that answered 5, that they're satisfied? Because if you're here, we'd love to get your business cards. We'd love to sit with you at lunch and find out what you're doing right. It'd be great. Nobody? Well, I guess they didn't feel the need to listen to the presentation because they're already pretty satisfied. So let me tell you what our core message is. Chip Heath in his book talks about the need to simplify your core message. So I wanted to just say it pretty simply what I'm here to tell you about today. The magic is in the mix. Okay? As marketers, the way we change consumer behavior is through a mix of communication and all sorts of different vehicles. That's where the magic is. So let's get that right. Let's do as Byron just said. Let's figure out what combinations of media vehicles change consumer behavior. Let's not focus on the ROI of our new media. Let's not focus on what's the ROI of this media. Let's focus on getting our mix right. What combination of media vehicles actually lead to changed consumer behavior? That's what we need to focus on as marketers today. So let's return to first principles, though. If you were at last year's conference, you would have been regaled with a lot of people talking about design thinking. There's one particular thinker in the field, a fellow by the name of Roger Martin, a former colleague of mine at Monitor, who's written a great book on design thinking called The Design of Business. In that, he introduces several different frameworks, but I want to talk to you about 2 today. The first is the concept of reliability versus validity. And I'm going to demonstrate what I mean by reliability versus validity by talking about a test for hepatitis. So what do you want from a good test for hepatitis? Well, first of all, the results need to be valid, i.e., they need to predict whether or not the patient actually has hepatitis or not. That's validity. Does the test meet the outcome that we want it to meet? You also want reliability. What do I mean by reliability? I mean that if you take a sample of blood from a patient, cut it 100 times, and run the test 100 times, it will produce the same result 100 times out of 100. Because then you know that the test actually produces the results it does. Marketers, we have the same desires. We need to have both reliability and validity. The challenge that we have is that our organizations are way out of balance. We tend to way overvalue things that we can predict as opposed to things that might be right. So Craig Stacey talked about the classic marketing mix model where the only thing that popped was TV. Yet we knew in our gut that that wasn't right, that that model didn't make sense. Yet we continued to trust the outputs of that model over and over again, even though we knew that the results weren't right. Why? Because they were predictable, they were stable. And in a world where our organizations want to meet quarterly earnings results with some degree of predictability, where they get punished for missing those results, and where we don't want to exceed our expectations too high because then it's going to be really hard to make those results the quarter after that, we value reliability far more than we value validity. And in fact, Roger would say that the kinds of things that lead to validity in organizations are often seen as no demonstration of proof whatsoever. And you guys agree. So when we surveyed you, 62% of you said that your organizations demand that you prove the ROI on any new investment in media before you would invest heavily behind it. The question I've got is, how would you know? So Byron talked a lot about the difference between theories and laws, and I'm going to introduce a similar framework here, which Roger talks about in his book, a framework called the knowledge funnel. This is a way of characterizing what we know about problems. How do we try to solve them based on the level of our understanding? And it goes from mystery through to heuristics, to algorithm, and eventually to code. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, a mystery is when we really have no idea what it is that how we're going to solve a problem. We have to use trial and error approaches. Think about how medicine would approach solving Lou Gehrig's disease today. A heuristic are rules of thumb, where people have seen patterns in the data, but those rules of thumb still need to be applied by experts. Think about tax laws, think about lawyers, think about where you need to go to someone who's an expert in their field in order to get advice. Algorithms are a set of steps. Let's bring this back to the world of marketing. Imagine you call into a customer service center. That customer service representative can solve your problem by taking you through a set of steps that have been pre-programmed. And eventually code is just all about being able to program it into a machine without any human contact. Well, we've pretty much codified a lot of our approaches to marketing today. We do trust some computer models to say, how much should we spend on what media that we make? So let's examine, how did we get to this stage where we're at these codifications? Well, let's start. We've gone from mystery to heuristic, so eventually we didn't know how to change consumer behavior, and we relied on people who saw some patterns in the data. The early advertising agencies, folks that Byron mentioned about Kotler and others, who the early thinkers in integrated marketing saw some patterns in the data that they turned into, and I'll use the correct term, Byron, theories, not laws. Okay? So that does call into question some of the algorithms and codes that we're working on today. We then said, okay, if those things are true, and I think Byron certainly showed us some data which would make us think that they may not be, which will only support what I'm about to say anyways, we turned it into algorithms. Many companies today have the 7 steps to launch a brand. First, you do a focus group. Then you do a basis test. Then you do some copy research. Then you do this. Then you do that. Those are the steps that our organizations are using more and more to launch a brand. And we have templates. So we've been able to take those heuristics that people saw in the data, turn them into, let me show it to him. So how did he get there? What was the story that got him there? Well, it all starts several years ago, actually a long time ago, not that long, 7, 8 years. My dad and my mom went on a trip to Europe. And remember, my dad likes to go fast, so he rented himself an Alfa Romeo, loved driving on the Italian highways. There's a speed limit, but it's not exactly enforced in Italy. And then when it came to his first fill-up, it was 120 Canadian dollars. In case you couldn't tell by the accent, I'm Canadian, as is my father. 120 bucks. And all of a sudden, there was mental availability for cars that had better gas mileage. It's amazing how that happened. All of a sudden, these smart cars just kept showing up over and over and over again in Italy. He started seeing them. His mind was open to there was a different class of car that might offer a different value proposition. Now, that mental availability became latent. My dad went back to Toronto. He wasn't really in the car market, but that latent mental ability was there. Okay, that memory structure had been formed. And several years later, there was a triggering event. So my dad had another car that he had bought after the Supra, which was a 97 Prelude that he drove into the ground. But there was some kid in his apartment building that really wanted to buy it. Wanted to buy it and wanted to soup it up with different parts. And my dad knew that he was going to get a better deal from this kid than he would on any trade-in. So he decided, I'm in the market for a new car, a triggering event. And what do we tend to do these days when we're in the market for a reasonably high consideration purchase? Well, we go through a self-directed research process. Okay? Consumers are more involved in their purchases these days. So as they start to think about what they might want to buy and they go through that research process, there's a lot of information available to them. So it's more important than ever that brands are available to be found. So this is a different version of mental and physical availability. This is about the availability to be found when someone's looking for you. So as it turned out, my dad was still looking for something in the peppier segment. He wanted a standard car. He wanted 2 doors. He wanted a sunroof. But he was kind of disappointed with what he was seeing in the marketplace. Nothing really was jazzing him too much. And then the economy started to turn downwards. And then all of a sudden, my dad got in the same mental space, like, well, maybe I want something a little more practical. Maybe I want something a little bit better with gas mileage with oil prices going up. And all of a sudden, that whole flood of memories that he had from Italy started flooding back, saying, the smart cars. And then he recalled that he had seen some paid media about a smart car launching in Canada. So he had seen some of that. He didn't really remember having seen it specifically, but all of a sudden it was there. It was latent in his head that he knew that smart cars were in Canada. He had perhaps seen a couple on the road. They didn't have large share. And then he had to get over the next hump, which was my mom. My mom said, Alan, Are you really going to buy a smart car? Are they safe? So my dad went through his research process and he came across a video on YouTube about smart car crashes. And a couple of independent experts had taken a smart car and tested it, literally crashed it in a bunch of different ways, showing how it had a reasonable crumple zone and all those sorts of things that you look for from cars. And while my mom, I will say, was not thrilled about him buying the smart car, he at least got her over the safety hump. She was not thrilled because all of a sudden her car became the car that we drove when we had friends around. So my dad got over the hump. He figured out that was a specific barrier, which was convincing my mom that it was safe. Then he did more research. Well, where am I going to buy it? Well, he actually didn't know that, much like we don't know that the parent companies of the brands that we buy, he didn't know that Smart was actually launched by Mercedes-Benz. So he did research and he found a dealership near him. He went to the dealership. There's the dealership there in Thornhill. And he got a trial for the weekend. And then he made a deal with the sales guy to pay cash in order for a discount to get one of the car lots that they use for a demo. So my dad was really in deal mode at this stage. And then, of course, my dad loves to talk. Okay? My dad loves to talk. He's passed that down to me. My dad loves to talk about stuff. So not only would he advocate to his friends and his family, now he would advocate all the truth, by the way. So my dad is not a smart car enthusiast. My dad says, it's got good, it's got bad, let me tell you about it. But he would get, because of the nature of the product design, which is so unique and calls attention to itself and actually creates mental availability, my dad would get people stopping him on the street at stoplights, literally honking their horn and going, roll down your window, which is still the universal symbol for rolling down your window. Even though kids growing up today are like, what the heck is that? What the heck is that? And actually, in the smart car, it's still this. There's no. So he'd roll down the window and say, what is that you're driving? And of course, my dad would have about 30 seconds to explain, and he'd try to explain. But he also did go on the internet and write a review of the dealer. There's a site called N49 in Canada where now Alan G has a rating of the dealer. So why do I tell you this story about my dad? Why is it that I sit here and describe to him? I mean, my dad is kind of funny, but ultimately, what we need is to understand our consumers' channel pathways to design communication plans. How is it that they get information at what stage in their buying process? Where do they start to form memory structures? Where can they be triggered? Where can we make sure that they've got the right information at the right stage in the buying process? By what mechanisms? So we need a bit of a map. So I'm a consultant, admittedly, so I have to come with some charts that look kind of complicated. So this is my dad's channel pathway. On the vertical side of the chart is the stage in the buying process. Okay? What stage is your consumer at in their buying process? Across the top are all sorts of different touch points. And you could put anything up there. You could put the pizza guy's t-shirt in your elevator, could be a source of media. It could be anything. It's not measured media, it could be anything. So what did my dad do? Well, my dad started off absorbing and forming impressions by product design. He had probably heard about it from friends and family. He was triggered by a friend. He then considered options based on third-party sites and friends and family. He researched it in a variety of different places. He eventually bought it at a dealership. Then he used, obviously, the product to trial it, and then he advocates online and in person with friends and strangers. That's the kind of map that we need to have an implicit understanding of how consumers in our category are getting information. How do they get information? How do they move from one stage to the other? How are we going to move them through that buying process? And as we think about going from one consumer to many consumers, because it's reach that we want, then we need to think about a heat map. So where is it that most people in our category are getting information, at what stage in their buying process? Because if we know the stage in the buying process and can match that to the place where they're getting information, we can design our communication at that touch point to facilitate them going to the next stage. It's not just about broad awareness, it's about actually moving them through their purchase process. Let's go to the next stage. And actually, one more thing on this last bit. It was not one media vehicle that caused my father to buy a smart car. I don't know how many touch points you counted, but there are probably over 10 interactions that eventually got him through his purchase funnel. So as a result, let's not bother trying to measure the return on any one of those individual channels. It's the magic is in the mix. It takes many vehicles to get a consumer through their purchase funnel. So the second stage of what we need to do about this moving up of the knowledge funnel is we have to start experimenting. And when I say experimenting, I don't mean this. This is sadly what many marketing organizations are doing these days as they think about what it means to experiment. Well, we'll dabble in this media and we'll try some of this out and we'll throw this up on the wall and we'll see if it works. Well, how would you know if it actually worked? Did you design a control group in? Did you test it against different kinds of consumers? Did you test it on the same brand? What was the means by which you were testing it? I had one marketer from a company who's actually represented in this room say to me a little while ago, "We've been testing texting for 5 years." I'm like, isn't the test over? What have you been testing? What were the parameters of the test? Why haven't you moved on or killed it? If it didn't work, why are you still working it? And if it did work, why aren't you doing more of it? Why are you still in testing mode after 5 years? Well, it's probably because they actually didn't really design the test properly. What does it take to do an experiment? Okay? Don't test, experiment. Okay? It's got to be systematic, okay, across comparable groups, i.e. split up a product line, split up a geography. You've got to have a control group. You've absolutely got to have a control group, because how would you know if one group performed better than another if you don't have a control group? And when it comes to testing marketing mix, it's got to be a meaningful portion of your budget. It's not about shifting a little bit to see the optimization. You won't get a meaningful result. And then if you get results and you like them, make some change, for goodness sake. You got the results. You got the proof. Okay? A company that does this really well, and I love this quote, so I'll just let you read it. So this is Gary Loveman, who's the CEO of Harrah's. And Gary is a PhD in economics from MIT and has brought a serious experimentation culture to Harrah's. They experiment on everything. They've got total rewards program of about 50 million members, and they're able to take that data and literally test, can I convert a customer in Southern California to come to a Las Vegas casino who has come to Las Vegas casinos on weekends with an offer to come on during the week instead of on the weekend. So that's a testable offer. I'm going to offer that to some people in Southern California and not to others, and I'm going to see if this particular offer can drive that behavior. Can I do that or not? Yes or no? Okay, no, let's move on. Yes, let's start to roll it out. And they take that approach to a lot of the different choices they make in their business. They've taken a serious test and learn approach. And what that helps them do is continue to grow. So they're getting the data. They understand the world's different, but they're saying, for our set of consumers that we know, how do we change their behavior? They're being very systematic about it, and they've been able to cut their traditional advertising spend as a result by about 50% since 2008, using other mechanisms in their marketing mix. So now let's put it together. We need to know our consumers, and we need to be able to experiment. So let's put it together and be willing to make some real meaningful changes if our experiments yield the results that we want to see. So first, we have to change the system, not the individual media. I'm going to pause on that for a second, because much of what we've been talking about up till now has been about maximizing the ROI on a media. And I'm just going to say we're asking the wrong question. Who cares? We know that each media works with other medias to change behavior. Instead of tinkering at the level of whether we should be 62% TV or 65% TV, let's verify that the heuristics that we based our overall marketing model on are in fact right for our business. Let's test that. So let's not tinker with our model. Let's actually test different models against each other. Let's look at different types of mixes to figure out which one is best for our business. Which one gets the most reach? Which one gets the most customers? It's going to be different in different categories. Different mixes of marketing will result in different changes in consumer behavior. And we need to figure out which one is right for our business. So when we experiment, this is the level of the experimentation we should be talking about, not within one of the little line items in that spreadsheet. So the magic's in the mix. We need to get that right. So let's measure that. So I want to go through a quick case study. How many of you have been following the developments at Ford over the last several years and seen some of the changes that they've made? Show of hands. Okay, a few of you. Ford has made some incredibly courageous changes over the last several years. They've been starting to put it in the right direction now, and it's amazing the kind of change that they've made. It's really been brave because they were facing a pretty tough situation. Okay, so the Ford brand was losing share in North America over the last several years. The market had gone down, and this was leading into the recession. So this was pre the 2008 bubble. So things could have been really bad for Ford. Then this guy came in. This is Jim Farley, their new CMO. And he's really decided that it's time to change the ideology at Ford. Question some of the heuristics that they had always used in order to do marketing. Changed a lot of things in the ideology. He said, we're going to have one team, one plan, one goal, one Ford. We're going to start to cut the church and state silos of PR and marketing. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. And started saying, the people from whom our consumers trust messages most are other consumers. So let's put our brand messages in the hands of other consumers. So what I want to talk to you about a specific example of today is the Fiesta launch. So as you can imagine, in 2008, Ford was faced with a pretty dismal situation. Okay? Not only had their share been going down, but they lost several billions of dollars. So you can imagine the conversation when it came to big traditional television budget conversations. So we had a question from over here about how do you maximize the limited budget you had. You can imagine what their limited budget might have been that year. And they had a product coming over from Europe and Asia, which was a successful subcompact car, which was a category that Ford didn't particularly compete in very regularly. People didn't wake up and think about Ford as being in that category. And the goal that Ford had, without a lot of traditional media dollars available to it, was how do I make consumers aware of my brand without spending that much money on media? Well, they had the cars, and the cars have been quite a success in Europe and Asia. And what they decided to do was bring over 100 cars from those geographies and put them in the hands of consumers. So what they did was they asked consumers to apply to be able to own one of these cars for several months. And the only requirement they placed on consumers was that they file a monthly report that would be available to all sorts of other consumers online to make people aware of it. And I've got a video here. I was lucky enough to be able to sit down with John Felice, the general manager of Ford Lincoln Marketing, on Friday, in fact, just last Friday. And I asked him to describe the Fiesta launch and some of the other changes that have gone on at Ford. So I'll play the video, and then we'll come back to the discussion so you can see Ford's case in their own words.
Well, first of all, it all starts with great product, and we had the hardware to really tell a great story with Ford starting 4 or 5 years ago. But fundamentally, we need to change our marketing approach. A couple big bets we've made in terms of marketing mix and change, is a much more solid bet in digital, in social media, and also changing a bit our approach with the agency. But it's really having the courage to turn our brand over to consumers to help us tell the story to gain credibility. Rather than hard data, it was more of an assumption that we can only do so much through traditional advertising. You know, you can put on a lot of weight on TV and tell your story, but we really had the intuition that if we translated it into a real voice and true advocacy, that it would be more powerful. You know, we had a new B car coming to the U.S. market. Hadn't had a B car in over 20 years in the U.S. People don't get up in California every day thinking about Ford to shop small cars. And we knew we had a big challenge to build awareness leading to the launch. So the idea is this. We decided to bring over 100 Fiestas that were being built in Europe. We had that unique opportunity as we globalize our product platforms. And so sitting with leadership to say, we're going to bring over 100 products, 100 vehicles, and turn them over and give them in the hands of consumers, and then enable them to tell their own feelings about this new car. And the question was, okay, well, how do you control that content and message? And the answer was, that's the beauty of it, you don't. We went online and we said, hey, here's an opportunity for you to drive this all-new product and let people submit their application for this on YouTube. And it was really neat because over time what happened is the level of the bar kept raising in terms of how creative and innovative these were. And so we had about 1,400 applicants. We screened those applicants to get those that are most socially vibrant in terms we get the best leverage. We looked at demographics. We looked at the various profiles to make sure we had a good spread from where we wanted in a geography standpoint. And then we turned the vehicles over to them. They went on their journey and then told their stories. If I ran a 30-second ad on TV and told you that I had the best fuel economy, you know, I don't know if you believe it. Now, if you had 6 friends tell you, you know, I have a Ford Fusion, or I had a chance to drive it, and I had the best gas mileage I've ever had in a mid-sized car, which one do you think would have greater credibility? The awareness in the segment that we had for the new Fiesta, as well as the brand health, were at segment competitive levels with the leaders in the segment, established entries from Toyota and Honda, before we spent $1 in advertising. A big launch for a product, you're going to spend $100 million. You know, that's a good budget, but that's not outlandish in terms of launching a whole new product. Some of these campaigns like Fiesta Movement we're talking about is a fraction of that amount. And again, you know, using that example to spend a much smaller dollar amount and build that type of awareness and brand opinion before I run the first ad, high leverage. If I look at the brand opinion and the movement we've seen, tracking from where we were, the movement we've made in the past 2 years in terms of the Ford brand opinion has been unprecedented. Not only for us, I mean, we've been hitting quarterly highs in brand opinion for several quarters in a row now. You know, again, 5 years ago, it would have been high single digits, 10% new media, so to speak, 90% traditional media, print, TV. Today, we're closer north of 30 in new media and 70% more traditional. You know, there's some launches because we have a lot of products, a lot of mouths to feed, could be all non-traditional in terms of the launch. The courage to be able to try things and learn quickly from mistakes. I mean, really, that's what it comes. A lot of the things we've done over the past few years has been, you know what, it's better to act quickly and fail quickly and see what's going. We do a lot of test and learn, and that's been a big, big help to us.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sean, thank you very much.
Steve, sure thing.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you.
So some pretty profound changes at Ford's marketing. And this is a company that basically had been doing the same marketing model over and over again. They'd launch a car, they'd launch it at the Detroit Auto Show, they'd spend lots of money building awareness on television, and through experimenting, they were able to find that they were able to generate the kind of awareness that they needed to launch a brand at fractions of the price. Now, John will go on record to say you absolutely still need to have traditional media in the model. So I'm not here advocating that you need to abandon your traditional media vehicles. You need to understand that the role that they play. And I think we genuinely need to learn whether or not, by the addition of social media and other new media vehicles, we can supplant some of the expensive media with some cheaper media, which has more credibility, perhaps. So as John did say, when you hear from others, you attach more credibility, more weight to that message than you do perhaps from just a general third-party message. I had breakfast today with a wonderful group of people from Bristol Myers Squibb, and we were talking about the challenge that you have in the pharmaceutical space of patients who trust other patients more than they trust their doctors. So when they hear about side effects, they trust what they've heard from someone else who's gone through the same situation versus what it is that their doctors say about the side effects that they might have. Why is that? Well, because over time we've been all conditioned to the fact that we get told that there's side effects on drugs all the time, right? But yet it's not concrete. It's not as concrete to us because we don't know whether or not we might get those side effects, and frequently we don't because we give patients a litany of side effects when they say, here are all the things you might have. But when you have a person who you know who has the side effects, all of a sudden the concreteness goes up, and you'll know from Chip Heath's book, when you've got something concrete, you'll remember the message. Now, obviously, the folks in the pharmaceutical space face quite the dilemma there because you need to be able to tell people all the possibilities because it's based on science and it's based on experimentation. But the challenge is that human condition that we know of, which is that you believe what you hear. So when it comes to something a little bit simpler like buying a car and fuel economy, certainly the credibility of that message goes a lot higher when you can hear it from other consumers. Certainly we see this demonstrated all the time from ratings on Amazon.com. So if we can somehow generate sufficient reach with these vehicles and boost the credibility, coupled with the messages that we want, we can get both reach and better credibility at the same time. So it's not an either-or situation. So Ford's taken that learning and applied it to other aspects of their business. So they launched the Explorer on Facebook. So rather than take it to the Detroit Auto Show, they launched it on Facebook, and they had all kinds of folks engaged in it. It was a #1 trending topic on Twitter the day it was launched. They had close to 100 million total impressions, and they had lots of site visits of people who were not necessarily in the market at the time for an SUV, but were now had impressions of the brand. So this is about creating mental availability, and as one of the principles of creating mental availability is getting people involved. So one of the things that you need to do in order to create those memory structures is have a bit of a two-way conversation so that new media is incredibly powerful when it comes to getting people involved in the brand, because that helps cement those memory structures. So does this work? Well, for Ford it did. So best first quarter in over 13 years. Profits are up. Share has gone up. So in 2009, share went up even though the category overall was falling, and share continues to grow. They were named Ad Age Market of the Year, so not bad over a 2-year stretch. But they had been willing to learn, they had been willing to make meaningful changes, and they were experimenting. They were testing and learning, and the things that didn't work, they discarded. But they recognized that the old approach simply wasn't working anymore, and we need to test and learn our way into a new approach. So all this sounds well and good, but why haven't we done this yet? Well, what's getting in the way? So we see 4 things that are getting in the way. One is the ROI trap that we find ourselves in. Now let's go back to that notion of reliability that I talked about at the start, that our organizations are really overvalue reliability and predictability. And many of you know you've had the conversations with your finance departments of, so how do you know that that new thing you want to do works? Can you prove it to me before I give you any money? And then we're in this vicious cycle of never getting any money to test anything because we can't prove it on paper before it happens. Well, that's the ROI trap. And what we need to do is, instead of worrying about proving the ROI in advance, let's go out and test it. But let's make sure we're testing at the right level, because the problem with testing the ROI of an individual media is because that number is predicated on all the other media in the marketing plan doing something. So when someone says we get a 10 times return on our investment in new media, well, that all assumes that there's all that other media backing it up. And as soon as you change that assumption, that number doesn't hold. So we've got this trap of let's just figure out what the return on our new media, but that doesn't presume a new model. And once again, we need to test the model as opposed to testing new media within the same old model. We are reluctant to conduct experiments. So those of you who were here last year would have heard Dan Ariely talk about this. Dan Ariely works with lots of companies to design experiments, but he often finds that near the launch of the experiment, all of a sudden you've got this reluctance of companies to actually conduct the same experiment. So you would have heard him tell a story of, well, we were getting close to launch, and we had our control group set up, and we had another group set up, and we were going to submit submit the plan, and we were going to launch the test, and then all of a sudden the marketer came to me and said, hang on a second. Does that mean that this one group of consumers won't get as good of an offer as this other group of consumers? And Dan was like, yes. Well, do we really want to do that? Do we really want to risk that group of consumers? And Dan was like, well, you might be risking them in the short term, but in the long run, you'll have much better data on which to make your decisions. Well, what do you think is the best one? Well, you're asking me to base it on my intuition, and I really don't know. We should run the test and find out what the best one is. But what do you really think is the best one? And ultimately, the conversation goes kind of like that, and they end up not running the test. We've really got to transform our organizations into real scientific experiment factories. We've really got to be willing to make meaningful changes and really test them against each other in order to see if our conclusions are valid. We've got to move back up our knowledge funnel to really determine whether or not the heuristics and the theories that our marketing algorithms and code are founded in are in fact valid on our business. Let's not trust it, let's go test it. Let's go experiment and learn. And if it doesn't work, let's change it. Then the last two things are things that we're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow. So we have the pleasure of being back up here tomorrow. I'll be here with my partner Sandy. And we're going to talk about a few of the structural barriers and the limitations of our marketing talent that are getting in the way of actually being able to put some of this into practice. So in some respects, this is to be continued. So we would very much like the opportunity to continue the conversation with you. So please stop by our table. We have a raffle for an iPad that will draw on Wednesday. Please do follow us on Twitter because we don't have a big multimedia media budget, so that's how we would like to get our ideas out to you. Follow me, and if you want a copy of this presentation, feel free to email me directly, and I would love to continue the conversation and hear any feedback that you've got. So at this stage, I'll take some questions, and then you guys are going to get some lunch. Thank you very much.
Questions for Steve? Questions for Steve? Let's go back to one of the questions we asked yesterday. Let's say it's the launch of a new-to-the-world category. No touch point pathway. What do you do?
New-to-the-world category, no data. Mm-hmm. You have to, honestly, you have to hypothesize. So the map that I showed of my dad, and it's perfectly acceptable to try to intuit what that might be. But what you quickly need to do is get some reps in the marketplace in order to test that theory. So there's nothing wrong with making decisions based on intuition. But what you can't do is continue to make decisions based on intuition over time. You've got to actually test them. So you need to get some things out into the marketplace. You can have a theory, get it into the marketplace, get some data, and quickly change it if you see that it's not working. But have a control group, have an opposing theory. Make sure that your test is designed in a way that actually yields you a result. If you just put one thing into the marketplace and say, is it doing well? Well, you don't know whether or not it was doing well because of what you did or because of some other factor that you weren't testing. So have a theory and then explicitly experiment and test it.
Chris?
Yes.
Hi, Annette Knuckle again from the Wisconsin School of Business. What would you do, or what would you say to people who have a very constrained and or tight budget, who don't have the resources to try again, and they need to do it right the first time? What would you say to those companies who would like to do this approach, which makes sense, but they just can't do it right now?
I think they need to figure out a way to do it. With all due respect, I mean, I know we all have limited budgets, but the great thing about the communications disruption is that there are things that you can do considerably less expensive than it took a long time ago. And the challenge with trying to just get it right the first time is that you'll never know whether you really got it right or whether something else polluted your data. So when it comes to experimentation, it's critically important that you set it up in a way that will allow you to make future decisions based on what you learned. You're not really testing and learning if you just do something and see if the results work, because you don't know if it was correlation or causation. So what you need to do is you need to figure out a way to test in a way that's cheaper. So innovate not in your approach to market, but innovate in how you test it.
Thank you.
Another question. I want to ask you a question about design thinking. In your experience, how many folks really are embracing it and practicing it?
It's varied. I will say I'm not an expert in design thinking, Marcia, so, and nor have I done any surveys of companies to say who's practicing design thinking. I think there are places where they are more open to doing the kind of design and then quick prototype learning that design thinking would call for. But I don't have a good sense for whether companies, maybe we can just do a quick survey in the room. How many folks in here are applying design thinking principles on their business? By that I mean fast prototyping, launching something in the marketplace, testing it, see if it's learning.
A handful.
So a handful, but not a ton. And I've seen a handful too, Marcia, but it's not been yet widely taught. And part of it is because MBAs that continue to populate our organization aren't trained in it for the most part. We're not trained in what it takes to think in a valid way. We're trained to think about reliability.
Which speaks to the programs at Stanford or here at the UW-Madison where it is being taught.
Or the plug for the Rotman School of Business where
There you
Roger
go,
is.
right, where Martin is, sure. Another question.
We've got one behind you.
Okay.
Here.
I'm curious on the Ford example where you're looking at the impact of a different marketing mix and creative ways of marketing. They've also vastly improved their product line. And even looking at what your father did when he was going through his process, it seemed like the product itself played an important role in that whole mix. So how do you disengage the impact that product has in this from the marketing side without having exactly the same product, which Ford doesn't? I mean, one of the key reasons I think Ford has improved their positioning is if you've rented a car recently, I rented Chrysler the other day, it was pretty terrible. Yeah. And, you know, compared to, I hope there's no one from Chrysler here, but, you know, compared to a Ford product, the actual experience of being in the vehicle was substantially different, irregardless of the marketing.
Yeah, so I don't, actually. I think if you don't have the great product, it's like advertising a restaurant with bad food. You're just going to go out of business faster. You've got to have a great customer experience behind what you're asking people to do. So if you're asking people to change behavior and that behavior eventually gets them to try your brand and they have a bad experience, you can bet that they're not going to come back to it quickly. So you absolutely need a great product. And I think this is one of the things that the original theorist got right. Isn't product one of the 4 Ps? So it's critically important. And as you saw with the smart car example and the example that I shared last year, is that your product can be a great source of building awareness if it's designed in a way to catch attention. I mean, think of the difference between noticing a PC versus noticing an Apple brand. Everyone notices the Apple brand when it's up because it's kind of striking. It's got I'm looking at our computer right now, it's got the little logo off the back so you see it. It can be a source of marketing too, but if you have a crappy experience, then you're going to be behind the 8 ball. And just to clarify one of the questions on strategy, this is where I would link the two of them. So people asked about differentiation versus in branding. What Porter actually said was that you need to have a differentiated business model, not necessarily a differentiated brand. And your differentiated business model can be about your cost advantage, can be about your product advantage. So that's certainly one of the areas where you need to invest in heavily. This is not a panacea by any respects.
Question in the back.
The back.
Oh, the back. Thank you. Hi, Leanne Moshe with GE Healthcare. And I just have a question. I think you make a lot of great points about having a theory, getting it to market quickly, and then gathering the data. And do you have any experience or advice for very long sales cycles, very relatively small units sold per year?
Yep.
Any advice in that arena?
As much as it's harder, but I think you can do one of 2 things. Is you can have a longer running experiment, which is expensive, and I'm not advocating that as the primary thing. But as much as you can possibly do, chunk up the experiment into things that you can see quicker. So if you want to test, as opposed to linking it back directly to end sales, can we test whether we can get consumers to behave differently like this? Can we test whether we can drive people to a website? Can we test whether we can drive people from a website to this? Can we test this to that? So as opposed to testing the entire walking through the purchase cycle, can you go through and conduct mini experiments like they do at Harrah's where they're able to see, okay, do I have a theory where I've got some data at each stage where I know that if I get them there, I can move them to there, and then I can move them to there. And by chunking up your experiments, you can perhaps get a flavor for the gestalt, although you might want to also have, at the same time, some longer-standing longitudinal experiments to really understand whether or not it's tracking to the overall model as well.
Another question for Steve. I think the next question is, what's for lunch?
What is for lunch, Marcia?
I don't know. We'll
You
find out
stumped
soon. Last question for Steve, anyone? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Super info, super presentation. We have a couple of announcements. Just a reminder to look at your watches. We will be back in here at 1:30, so you have time for lunch and to network and time to visit the various tables of our sponsors where there are giveaways. As Steve suggested, you can enter a drawing at the monitor table for an iPad, get more information from him on the stuff that he just presented. So do take the time to do that. Be back in your seats about 1:30. The next speaker is Susan Gambardella, the Senior Vice President of Coke. She's in charge of all of their agency relationships. She has a great case by which to share a lot of the learning we've had the last couple of days to point out the value of a big idea that's very resonant and how they launched it with great penetration. When you sit down at lunch today, and by the way, lunch is going to be out these doors and at the tables overlooking the lake. When you sit down at lunch, you'll want to sit down at a table that corresponds to the number on your name tag. There's a little number on your name tag. What we do every year for this particular lunch is we look at all of you and we mix and match you in a way that you might not otherwise have done. So we might look at your job title, your category, and try and match you with other folks we think you'd find it interesting to get to know, to share stories with. So please, lunch according to your name tags. You might see some old friends, you might see friends from your company, you might meet some new folks around the table. And to sort of break the ice, let me suggest this starter lunch conversation. One of you at your table organize the group and say, let's introduce ourselves around the room. And when you around the table, and then when you do that, say, what's an orthodoxy you'd like to kill at your organization? Or an orthodoxy you've heard today that you think should be killed, but you disagree. So kick off your conversations about orthodoxies, and I think you'll find it's easy to get to know folks, and you can take it from there. After lunch, we'll not only enjoy Susan and some other great speakers, but we'll then address whether we can have our cocktail hour outside today or inside. And a reminder, too, that if you would like your Facebook Effect book that was given you upon registration, bring it with you, because after our last speaker today, he's happy to sign it for you. So that's all for now. Enjoy lunch. We'll see you back in the room at 1:30.